Good morning, Emily.
Hi, Dan.
What are we talking about on this balmy September morning?
Adversarial and collaborative divorce, how to divide property as part of a divorce, and time management tips for a new financial planner in the industry.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, so we have depressing, and practical. You're really stacking the deck today.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of questions on that area, so you know me.
Oh, fair enough. All right, take us away. What do we want to know about adversarial and collaborative divorce?
Well, I think first of all, we just need to kind of set the scene on what each of those is. I think a lot of people, when they hear adversarial, they automatically assume it's kind of tearing each other's eyes out, going for as much as you can possibly get, which is not necessarily always the case.
Yeah, so essentially a divorce is going to be by default adversarial from just a legal standpoint. So it helps to understand what a collaborative divorce is by contrast to that. So a collaborative divorce is a deliberate and structured process. It's not just saying, hey, we're going to be cool with each other. It is saying, okay, we're going to go through the collaborative divorce process. I'm going to have a lawyer. You're going to have a lawyer. We're going to hire a CDFA. We're going to have a mediator. We're going to approach this in a very deliberate sense where we can have professional representation and help, but our goal is to work together to make this as painless and low damage as possible because divorce is a wealth destroying activity. Sometimes people think that they're going to get divorced and walk away at least 50-50, but nobody does. You might walk away, let's say 49-49 or 45-45. The point is, a portion of your wealth will be destroyed by the process of divorce. So you never end up with half of what you started with. Collaborative divorce attempts to solve that by saying, let's have a structured process where we try to come out of this as whole as possible and with as little conflict as possible. And the stakes of that from the professional side is that if anybody starts causing trouble, right? If somebody says, we're going to take you to court, we're going to sue you over this, we're going to throw roadblocks up in the way, etc., all the professionals are fired. So not only does the couple getting divorced have to cooperate, but the professionals also have to play nice. I mean, they have a responsibility to their clients, but they should not be starting shit. And if they do, then they have an ethical obligation to back out of the process, and the divorce converts over to an adversarial divorce.
So it sounds like adversarial's quite a bit more common just because the other alternative is so specific to everything working perfectly.
Well, not perfectly per se, but people have to cooperate and acknowledge and deliberately engage in that process versus adversarial, which is just sort of the default. And adversarial can be no lawyers, it can be being super nice to each other and trying to work things out evenly, but essentially it just means, hey, neither party has an obligation to think about or act in the best interests of the other party. And that can be everything from just, hey, we're just going to divvy things up ourselves and try to do this as sort of just a courthouse divorce, in the same way you think of a courthouse wedding, versus going all the way to the point where you end up in front of a judge and you have two attorneys just beating the crap out of each other over who's going to get what and how things are going to work.
Right. Well, okay, at what point in the whole separating process do you recommend that people engage an attorney? Should they talk to them early on and just get a feel for it, or wait until you know more what you want to do?
I am of a pretty firm opinion that everybody doing a divorce needs an attorney. And the reason for that is, even though you may go into it with an intention of just saying, hey, we're just not in love anymore. We don't hate each other. We're not mad. Nobody did anything wrong. We want to be cool. We want to be, thoughtful and careful about this and be really considerate of each other's needs. There's a couple of problems with that. Number one, it assumes that your ex-spouse is acting as a good faith actor the same way you are, and that may not be the case, right? They may know something you don't know, or they may have engaged legal counsel and you are now at a disadvantage. And so just being mindful that you you've never been divorced. Most people have never been divorced before. And if you're getting divorced, it's probably the first time you're doing that. And there are professionals who have done this hundreds or thousands of times. And the idea that you're going to go into this process and you're just going to sort of like handshake and smile your way through it is quite foolish, simply from the standpoint that not only does divorce vary state by state, couple by couple, municipality by municipality, but also that at the end of the day, you have no experience in this process. So I'm pretty firmly of the opinion that even if you want to have the nicest divorce possible, you should at the very least be consulting with an attorney who specializes in family law, to get an understanding of what you need to know in this process and what you should be thinking about in this process versus just trying to Google it and downloading some forms from the court.
Right. Well, as long as we're talking about hiring professionals, what about us as financial planners? I've, of course, had a few meetings with people that are going through this process, and, each one is different, but would you in general recommend that they each hire their own versus trying to get one to go through the process? I mean, I'm sure you have an opinion on that.
So, if this is an adversarial divorce, as the financial planner potentially involved in that process, I want my particular client to hire a financial planner, and I don't want their spouse to hire a financial planner, because then we're going to somewhat the advantages of hiring us might start canceling each other out a little bit. I think the easier way to think of this is that as a financial planner who gets involved in divorce processes, as an ex-certified divorce financial analyst, I don't hold that accreditation anymore, but as somebody who's had that training and that education, you essentially have one of two roles in divorce, and it's going to depend on the outcome that your client is looking for. Either you can help them accomplish the most equitable division of assets. So, something to keep in mind in the divorce process is that the outcome is not supposed to be that everybody ends up with 50-50. It's that the division of assets is supposed to leave everybody in as good a position as they could be relative to the other. So, equitability is more important than equality in the division of assets, and financial planners, particularly those who've had the CDFA training or do a lot of divorce work, can be very helpful in accomplishing that, where often a lot of people will just say, hey, 50-50, you get half, I get half, and that may not actually be equitable depending on how those assets are split up. The second piece to it then is that the other role I can have as a financial planner involved in divorce is if it is genuinely adversarial, if it's an FU sort of a divorce, as a trained professional, I'm very good at putting my thumb on the scale and showing what looks like an even 50-50 division of assets that is actually quite skewed in favor of a client. And if the other party doesn't have their own financial planner or their legal counsel is not terribly competent, that division of assets can be enormous. I've helped clients get as much as a 70-30 split in their favor, even though the balance sheet looked equal, because we can take into account things like the appreciation and value of the assets, the tax treatment of the assets, and so on. So, again, sort of like trying to be your own attorney in court for criminal law or civil law. If you go into a divorce and think that the best approach is just going to be to take all the numbers on your balance sheet and divide them by two and call it a day, I'm here to tell you, as a professional financial planner who's done quite a bit of divorce work, that if your spouse hires me and asks me to divide things up in a way that favors them versus you, I'll show you a balance sheet that's 50-50, but I guarantee your spouse is walking away with far more wealth than you are, and that's your fault for not engaging professionals in the first place.
Do you think that a lot of people feel like it's fair because they'll have attorneys looking over it, even though that's not necessarily their specialty? They're just, they know the legal aspect of it, but not the financial part of splitting something 50-50.
There's a lot of attorneys who do family law. Family law is a major area of practice, and I've said before, and I'll say again, I love attorneys. I think attorneys are some of the best professionals to work with, and I enjoy them immensely. But there are a lot of attorneys who are not good at math and who don't know anything about taxes. And so I've had opposing counsel look at a balance sheet that favored a client 70-30 and say, "Yep, that looks good to me," and not object to it whatsoever. And again, the client walked away net of taxes with 70% of the household wealth. So, in those particular terms, a lot of people might think, well, if I have hired an attorney, that's the only protection I need. But your attorney is here to practice law. They are not here to do financial math. Now, really good family law attorneys will certainly be able to spot that and call it out when they see it, or they'll just fight you by default because they know that if you're presenting it, it has to favor you in some way, shape, or form. Right? They just sort of assume there's no good faith activity there, which is very fair of them to assume in an adversarial divorce. But that said, I think many attorneys in this area of practice are not very good at actually recognizing when things are skewed. They just tend to look at the balance and say, oh, it looks like 50-50. That makes sense to me.
Well, what about when it is a collaborative divorce and everything is going as smooth as possible, and the couple that is separating hires say, just you, and they just want it to be 50-50, you can still do that too?
Certainly. And that's where in a collaborative divorce, you are working for both of them. Whereas in an adversarial divorce, even if they're trying to be cool about it, you do have to say, hey, one of you is my client. I can't represent both of your interests. So at your direction, I'll try to divide things as equally as I can if that's your intent in the adversarial divorce. But in a collaborative divorce, you can actually work for both parties because that's part of the deal in the structured collaborative divorce process. Same thing can sort of apply to attorneys, but attorneys have an ethical obligation to serve their specific client, which is why you end up generally with two attorneys in a collaborative divorce instead of one.
All right. Well, what about when there's kids involved? I know there's specialists that'll kind of help with the custody and splitting up of all of those things. Do people need to also hire that type of professional?
That can be beneficial. I think that really does come down to how aggressive the parents are being about parenting time, child support, maintenance, those sorts of things. I do think kids is the area where divorce tends to get nasty more than over money issues. But in that particular context, I think that really depends on what the disposition is. Some couples just look at it and say, hey, we'll just go ahead and do a 50-50 split of parenting time, and that is not a big conflict for us. And there, I think you're probably pretty safe. I think in cases where there's an argument for much more disparate time, like, hey, I get the kids 90% of the time and you can see them on some holidays, that's a space where then you probably do want to bring in those specialists.
All right. And I want to quickly kind of talk about the timeline of all these divorce things. I talked with someone a few weeks ago that was being very kind in their separation. They wanted things 50-50. They said, I don't want to screw over my partner. And in an attempt to make everything easier and simpler, they rolled all their, retirement accounts they've had throughout their life at different jobs into one account so it can be easily split up. However, some of the retirement accounts in question were premarital, and they didn't really understand why that mattered or why it was important.
Yeah, I mean, they made a huge mistake there. This will vary state by state. The statutes are very specific here, so I'm going to speak in general terms and with a slightly Colorado bias here. But generally speaking, what you bring into the marriage stays yours when you leave the marriage. So things like property you owned previously, accounts you owned previously, assets you owned previously, is yours from the outset. And as long as it's not commingled, meaning, hey, I had $10,000 in a checking account, and when I got married, I left that checking account aside and I opened new accounts and put new income and new money into the new accounts. As long as you've kept your assets separate, then they stay separate. They're not part of the marital estate. Same thing can be applied to things like inheritances, right? If your parents pass away or something and leave you money, as long as that money stays separate from your shared accounts, that can then be held separate from the marital estate. But when you commingle things, if you had, let's say, a 401k from before your marriage and the 401k after your marriage, and you were funding the 401k after your marriage, and then you later roll both of those over into the same IRA, now that money has been commingled, and generally speaking, that's going to become part of the marital estate. You will get some attorneys who might try to make an argument that we can calculate a division of that asset, but generally speaking, that's going to be a very tough case to win. And even if you win that allocation, you're probably not going to win the majority of it. You're probably going to end up with quite a deep discount there. So consolidation for simplicity can make the balance sheet look better and can make it seem easier to divide assets, but you might be handing money over to your ex unintentionally without any awareness that you're doing so. And knowing the case that you're thinking of in that particular context, the other thing there is, in the interest of being nice to each other and going through a adversarial divorce, but we're being cool about it. I know in that particular case you're referencing, that person that we're talking about is going to get rolled over by their ex because they are, in the interest of being nice, just shoveling money into the division of assets that they don't have to. And in turn, the way they're thinking about dividing up assets is going to result in them being left out of a pretty major asset.
Yeah. So it again highlights the importance of maybe hiring a professional before you start the process, before you make any moves, and get some good advice.
There's an old joke amongst tax professionals that the most common reason they have somebody come to them is somebody does a thing and then gets the tax bill and comes to the professional and says, oh my gosh, I did a thing and now there's a tax bill. What can you do for me? And the answer is nothing. Same thing applies in the divorce world. If you start shuffling stuff around before you engage professionals, you are tying the hands of your professionals, right? There's nothing we could do for that person who already commingled their assets. We can't undo that process. There's nothing that you can do to get out of a legal mistake you've made in the process of trying to be cool about your divorce, if you haven't engaged the attorney prior to the fact, who can then help you undo it. There's some cases where people do things like prenups without legal counsel, where they can get it thrown out because one did and one didn't. But generally speaking, if you're going to take this process seriously, and you should take this process seriously, you should be hiring the professionals to start. You should not be trying to hire the professionals after you run into a problem.
Right. Well, this kind of leads into my second point about dividing up a house in a divorce. For most people, that's, I'd say, in my experience, most of the time, a pretty emotionally charged decision because they're like, this is my home. Maybe we raised our kids here, or we both want to stay in it, whatever. I mean, first of all, do you recommend one trying to buy out the other, this and that, or just put the house up for sale and split the proceeds and take the emotion out of it?
So I think whether you should or shouldn't divide the house is going to heavily depend on how much appreciation and equity is in the house. For example, if the house has, let's say, $200,000 of equity in it, you can potentially just sell the house and split the equity and call it a day. There is value in the asset beyond that, though. So there's the costs of moving, there's the school district access, there's the convenience for commute, the social circle that you've built as a family that your kids might have. So there's a lot of intangibles that go into it, but also just from a certain standpoint, depending on when you bought the house. I mean, just to buy a house 3 years ago, you could get a 3% mortgage rate, and today you're going to be north of 6. So a home liquidation may itself be equitable, but then the follow-on may be problematic, where one has to pay a lot more for a house, or both of you have to pay a lot more for a house after the fact because of where things are. So there's a difference between just the division of the asset and what that division produces.
Right. Well, and okay, so the scenario where one person stays in the house and the other one leaves and then just tries to kind of buy out their half some other way. That I've had some questions from people about triggering taxes. They say, does that count as a sale if they just sign off and kind of give the house to me? How is that treated?
So if it's inside of a divorce settlement, generally speaking, that won't necessarily be a taxable transaction because it's still marital property. And during the course of the divorce, really, you're just shifting money around. And inside of a marriage, generally speaking, there are not gift limitations or restrictions. Now, there are rules about the 3 years following a divorce and asset transfers. I'm not going to get into the details here, but essentially, if you've gotten divorced, there are certain look backs that can occur over the next 3 years that account for the fact that you might use divorce to transfer property outside the scope of the divorce and avoid any taxes or gift issues there. So there can be taxes that get levied against you if this process takes several years to accomplish. So just being mindful that, if it's happening during the course of the divorce as part of the settlement, taxes shouldn't really be an issue any more than they would be if you were just engaging in transactions as a married couple. So shifting money between you as parties is not a huge deal. But on the other side of that, just because you have the marital advantages doesn't mean that you get to ignore normal capital gains taxes around non-qualified assets or potential income taxes for the distribution of retirement assets and so on.
Hmm. Okay, so if, let's say we are trying to have one person buy out the other party and they get to keep the house, how do they go about funding that? Sometimes they don't necessarily have the cash on hand to be able to just give them, the value of half the equity and say, there you go. How do they fund that? If they take out a second mortgage, can they do that? Get a different type of loan?
It's going to depend on whose name is on the mortgage, whose name is on the property. So a couple of options potentially present themselves. So let's say, spouse A bought the house and spouse B, is just a co-owner but isn't on the mortgage. Spouse A potentially could just take out a home equity line of credit and use that to pay out the equity on the property and not have to do a refinance. But if spouse A and spouse B are both on the mortgage, then you're going to have to go through a refinance process to get spouse B off of the property. And off of the mortgage, because that'll then still count as a mortgage if they want to turn around and go buy their own home, and that'll affect their credit worthiness and their ability to obtain financing and so on. So it gets a little bit messy there. Some alternatives out there that don't involve refinancing or that don't involve utilizing HELOCs or what are called QDROs, or qualified domestic relations orders. These are often shorthanded as quadros. But when we do something like a quadro, we're essentially signing over things like 401k balances to our spouse in order to then give them access to retirement money. There are special provisions around quadros that allow people to avoid the early distribution under 59.5% 10% penalty that's applied to early retirement distributions for then using some of that money to purchase a home. But I can say that's an example where you will burn money to make a down payment because you'll end up with a taxes on the taxes of the taxes problem in taking retirement assets out to pay for a home. You could use something like a Roth to avoid the tax impact, but then you're burning some of your most valuable money in the course of a divorce. So all this to say, dividing up the house is a really potentially quite complex and expensive endeavor. Functionally, I really like the wisdom of one of my favorite family law attorneys, Anna Bond, on this. She likes to describe your house as a box. It's an emotionally important box, but it's still just a box. And so, it can be very convenient to get to stay in the box, or it can be very valuable to divvy up the ownership of the box. But we should be very careful to think of a home, even your primary residence, as an asset that is more or less valuable than other assets. And we should be mindful of that in the division of assets, which assets we're trying to pursue.
So, not burning money out of your 401k just because you like the house you live in, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a real dollars example. We had a divorce client many years ago who essentially, got a quadro as part of the division. So the ex got to stay in the house. Our particular client ended up with a huge amount of 401k money, and they took a distribution to put about $400,000 down on the house they wanted to buy, post divorce. So that $400,000 down payment resulted in something like $610,000 or $620,000 of taxes. Sorry, the gross distribution rather was about $620,000. So they're paying $210,000 to $220,000 in taxes, so they can put a $400,000 down payment on a property. So again, it's just a very wealth destroying activity to utilize something like retirement money to purchase a home. It might be a very practical decision in terms of being able to afford a property in the place you want to live and so on. But again, what we said up at top, right? Divorce is a wealth destroying activity always. Nobody comes out of divorce with more than they started.
Right. Well, it sounds like the lump sum option of, buying out your partner is complicated. Is there ever a way to do a series of payments over time rather than one big chunk and kind of slowly buy them out? Can you structure it that way?
You can, but that then runs the risk of triggering the post-divorce taxable recapture rules. So essentially, if there's a stream of income or payments that are not part of child support or actual maintenance, sometimes called alimony, then those payments are technically wealth transfers, potentially subject to gifting rules and that taxable clawback period. So it can be done that way, but the specific numbers involved have to be paid attention to very carefully, or you can end up with really large extra taxes being levied on that.
So maybe if you did it within that 3-year time span and were very careful, you can, but
The 3-year time span is the more dangerous period, actually. That's where the taxes can really get laid on quite heavily. Post 3 years, you've got a lot more flexibility. You can also structure divorce settlement to do certain things like contingent sales. So let's say you're getting divorced, you have older teenagers, and you say, okay, I think we agree we should sell the house, but they are 16 and 17 years old. They're really close to graduating from high school, and then they'll go off to college. It would be a big disruption to sell the house and move. So we're going to agree that we will sell the house after the second one graduates high school. So you can stay in the house. And because of the structure of our divorce settlement, we agree that we will sell the house and divide up the value of the house after that happens. And things like the capital gains exemption for 2 out of 5-year residents will still apply to that sale, even if it's been a couple of years and one of them no longer lives in the house. So there are some contingent and conditional transactions that can be done as part of a divorce without triggering excess taxes or penalties or problems. But again, it really comes down to what is directly agreed to in writing as part of the divorce settlement, as opposed to just sort of good ideas we're throwing out there after the fact.
Well, on that very happy, exciting note, I'm going to transfer over to my third and final question.
We're going somewhere happy. Yay.
I have to end on a good note. We can only talk about divorce for so long before people are going to quit listening. So, I've been a financial planner now after my promotion for a little bit longer, and you and I have talked a lot about exactly what that means and what I should be doing and several other points that I've got in my mind. But I kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit in the podcast for anyone that's listening that is a new or aspiring financial planner, and also maybe give a little bit of context to everyone else in our lives that I do get a lot of questions for people. Okay, you don't work on commission, you're just salaried. How does that work? What are you doing? I think people are used to the commission structure of a financial planner who has to get out there and get clients no matter what and really be pretty aggressive about it, whereas I'm not, and I don't have to.
Sure. I'm not sure that I'm hearing a question here, but that's good context. So, what
Okay.
is the question here, or what do we want to discuss here?
Well, I think a lot of people, the questions I'm getting anyway from people in my interactions, because I've been out in the community a lot, I've been doing networking things and volunteering or whatever, because I have the time to do so since I'm not out cold calling people and knocking on doors. And people are kind of confused about why I don't have to do that. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, first of all, why you do the salary versus, the kind of eat what you kill uh, setup that a lot of other places have.
Sure. So, I mean, to just answer that question really directly, I don't think any professional can thrive and grow off of a sales basis. And that is something that is directly contradictory to the sort of the broader wisdom of the financial services industry. Pretty much almost everybody, call it 95% plus of people who come into the professional financial planning, essentially just have a sales job to start, and then they get to learn financial planning as they go. That has been the way of things across big insurance companies, big wirehouses, big mutual companies. Right? You'll come in and essentially you have a job to sell X 10,000, X tens of thousands, let's say 40, 50, $60,000 worth of life insurance, or you must bring in $10 million in investable assets in your first 2 years. And you will get paid solely to do that. And that's the industry writ large. But I don't think any self-respecting profession can grow on the basis of just sales. Sales is a necessity in any business, but to make that the primary thing and say, hey, if you want to do this for a living, you've got to sell first is, I think, very problematic. So the salary is really just to say, look, first and foremost, you're a professional. Think of yourself as a professional, right? You're not a lawyer, but think of yourself as a lawyer. You're not an accountant, but think of yourself as an accountant, right? Lawyers and accountants generally don't get paid on commission. They get paid salaries, and they might have production requirements or business development requirements, but they are not being paid on a per sale, per dollar basis or something like that. So that's just the basic answers. I think the profession needs salaried positions to grow. I can certainly speak more about the why of your workday, but that's the basic argument for why you have a salary and you're not just being paid 60% of the business you bring in.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the structure of my workday because I have now quite a bit of freedom time wise and activity wise for what I'm choosing to do. Why do you let me do that? I'm all for it, but I'm not exactly making you a ton of money right now, and you're a business owner.
Yeah, I was gonna say technically net negative a couple $1,000s a month as we
Yeah.
go here. Yeah, I mean, so the basic thing here is, I think first and foremost, if you really think about the best lawyers, the best accountants, the best banks, the best any business you can think of, you don't think of them because they knocked on your door one fine Tuesday afternoon and said, "Hey, do you need a checking account or do you need a tax preparer?" Like that's not how they do business. You recognize those firms and those companies because not only do they do excellent, high quality professional work, but because they enjoy a strong reputation in their community, right? That's the best law firm in Longmont. That's the best tax preparer in Boulder County, right? You know them by the quality of their work, but you also know them by the brand of the organization and the professionals they employ, right? They serve on boards of directors. They are lead volunteers on committees. They are active and involved and engaged in the community. So a lot of the freedom you have in your time today is because just as by the coincidence, the flow of things, you've had many potential client conversations over the last few weeks, but you've not been given clients yet. Now we have clients, right, that we could just say, hey, these 10, 15, 20 clients are yours now, go get them, make sure you serve them well and so on. That's something that could happen over time, but that's not how we've approached it. Instead, we've given you opportunities to have conversations with new potential clients. And by extension from that, we also have put ourselves in a position to recognize your contributions in those conversations to potentially work with those clients if they decide they want to work with us. But other than that activity and other than sort of the activity of studying and still learning the craft of being a financial planner and increasing your knowledge and so on, your responsibility then is to work on the brand of the firm. It is to be engaged in our community. It's to be a good corporate citizen of this place we call home. And so that involves giving you a lot of free time and flexibility because you have a lot of free time right now to to be a volunteer, to engage in networking activities, to volunteer at nonprofits, to serve on committees, and so on. And as you start to have more clients, you'll have less free time to do that. But the only other alternative then is either we just hand you a pile of clients to serve, which there's an argument for that, but I don't think that's the best way to go about things. And I don't know that the clients would just appreciate suddenly being handed over. The other option is to have you door knock and cold call. And again, I return to what I said up top. I don't think anybody thinks of the best firms in any profession as being the firms that smile and dial or knock on doors. I think they think of them by their professional reputation and the culture and community that they help build.
Well, and I know you've structured your company from way back when with the intention that my role and myself and everything, this is how it would be. You knew that going into it. But is there a way for other business owners who maybe don't have everything set up for this to transition into this kind of structure? You've planned well in advance for it.
I mean, the answer here is somewhat self answering, which is you plan ahead for it and you fund it and you accept that it's an investment. A lot of small business owners think of their employees as expenses, and from a P&L standpoint, yes, all employees are expenses, but that's not how financial planners think about things normally or should think about things, right? It's an investment of capital into the individual. It's an investment of time and energy into the training and the development of the individual, so that they can become more and more productive members of the firm over time and more helpful to clients and the community over time. That takes a big trade in experience, but part of the issue here, part of the reason we don't see more of that is just because the alternative is so attractive, right? If you go work at a big mutual insurance company or any of the wirehouses, some of them will offer like a temporary salary, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to start, that then kind of rapidly goes away. But ultimately, what a lot of them do, in fact, the vast majority of entry-level positions are, nice to meet you. Here we'll do the interview and screening process, and if you seem qualified and eligible, we'll talk to you about getting licensed. While you're in the process of getting licensed, we're also going to have you produce a list of 100, 200 people you know and their names and phone numbers and so on. And the second you have your license, you're going to call all of them or email all of them or text all of them and try to set up a meeting to talk about what you're doing now and why you'd be a good fit for them. And that is so attractive to the industry because the investment on the side of the business is essentially non-existent, right? They have to pay for their recruiter or their hiring manager, but that's maybe a couple $1,000 a month, maybe $10,000 a month, depending on their seniority, and that's their entire cost. And then they can bring on a theoretically unlimited number of hopefully qualified people. The people will all be 1099 contractors, so they'll have to pay for their own licenses and so on. They're providing you with a leads list kind of as part of their onboarding process. And then, if they sell and make money and earn commissions, then the company will also make profits off of those commissions or off of the sale of the products. And it costs them little to nothing to do that at scale. One of the biggest financial companies in the country has a very famous internship. It's the biggest financial internship in the entire country. And quite literally, it is, come on, we'll get you a life insurance license. You're going to produce a list of 300 people and you're going to spend your entire summer cold calling them and having conversations and trying to sell them our insurance products. And for the students or the kids who do that, they actually do very well at that. They might make tens of thousands of dollars over the summer, so they'll give it rave reviews. But a ton of those kids fail out of it, don't do very well. But hey, thanks for your list of 200, 300 friends and family. We're just going to hand that to the next advisor in line and have them cold call them and say, hey, your cousin, your roommate, your neighbor, whoever this was with us recently and said we should give you a call, because technically they did. And that's unfortunate, but that will stick around so long as it's allowed, because the cost benefit ratio is phenomenally an advantage of those companies that do it that way.
Well, I can certainly say I'm glad that I don't have to do that. I don't think my friends and family would appreciate the cold calls.
No, generally not. And as somebody who came up through another firm before I launched this firm and had to do a version of that, it's both heartwarming and depressing how many people will and won't support you, right? Some of the people you think surely could use what you now do or what your firm offers will say no, and some people will surprise you and just throw in behind you. And that's sort of the weird and scary thing of it. This industry and this profession, because of that sales emphasis and that pipeline we just spent a few minutes describing, has about about a 85% failure rate over the first 3 years, right? So 85 out of 100 people who try to become financial advisors or planners who go through that path will fail out. And the survivors have phenomenal careers and work-life balance and experiences, make good money, all of that. But what a brutal way for a profession to exist, right? Imagine if 85% of lawyers were not practicing law 3 years after graduating law school, or 85% of accountants were not doing taxes or audit or controller work, right? 3 years out of accounting school or grad school. I mean, just what a brutal way for a profession to exist. So I don't believe in that. I understand the economics of it. We as a firm could make a lot more money if we just aggressively recruited college kids and career changers to give it a try. But I don't think it's ethical, and I don't think a profession can thrive and be respected if fundamentally it's just a sales business.
Well, once again, I'm glad to hear it. Very appreciative.
Glad to offer you the opportunity. I'll not pat myself on the back here quite so much, but I'll say a thing that I know I've said to you before. But you are extraordinarily lucky to have a stable salaried position that is not commissions only or sales first. It is the exception in this industry. I hope it becomes the norm in this industry, but there's a long road ahead to get there.
Yeah, it seems like it since it's so rare.
All right. Well, Emily, it's been some good conversations. I'm glad we were able to get away from the depression of divorce just so we could talk about the depression of the talent pipeline in financial planning. So what have you learned over the past couple of weeks as you've been getting out and being involved in the community and having conversations with potential clients and so on?
This is not a very technical answer, but I've definitely learned the importance of time blocking. We've talked about that in the office for a long time, but you can really get a lot done in a day if you use that strategy that you always use, block off the big things ahead of time and kind of fit in everything else in between. I am feeling very productive.
Yeah, I mean, it's to give it the analogy for anybody who's familiar with it, it's just the big rock theory of time management, right? Put the big stuff on the calendar, put smaller stuff around it, put tiny things around that, and then try to just fill in the gaps as you can. But yeah, I mean, you can get a huge amount done if you schedule ahead and plan ahead. I think waiting for your day to happen to you is the classic mistake of somebody with too much time on their hands.
Certainly. I am really enjoying copying the way that you do your calendar.
Well, I hope you can keep it as full as I do for the rest of your career, because it makes the days go quickly. And, I referenced it earlier a little bit, but being a financial planner is, by all studies and indications and personal experience, one of the most rewarding and satisfying careers you can have. And I think in part that comes from having a day full of making a great difference in people's lives.
What a wonderful way to end a podcast.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.